It's my honour to introduce this evening's lecturer, the Very Reverend Professor David Fergusson, OBE. David was born in Glasgow, and I think it's fair to say remains very much a Scot, despite the fact that he's currently serving as Regius Professor of Divinity in Cambridge. Just as last year's lecturer, Lord Williams, remained every inch a Welshman while serving as Archbishop of Canterbury. It's not the first time that David Fergusson has ventured south of the border in his immensely distinguished career. And after studying at Glasgow and then Edinburgh, he came to Oxford to do his PhD. He's been a professor of theology for well over 30 years, serving in that capacity first at Aberdeen, then at Edinburgh, now at Cambridge. At Edinburgh, he held that position for 21 years, also serving for half that time as principal of New College. He's a fellow of both the British Academy and the Royal Society of Scotland. He's also a Presbyterian minister and spent a few years early in his career in parish ministry. He's now an ecclesiastical member of the Royal Household of Scotland, serving both as Dean of the Household and also as Dean of the Order of the Thistle. And in those capacities, he was a member of the royal procession in the recent coronation ceremonies. I think it would be fair to say that our Boyle lecturer this year is the most distinguished theologian in Britain, and his only serious rival for that title would be last year's Boyle lecturer. David's academic work has ranged widely, but the topics of creation and providence have been central to it, and that has led to a serious engagement with contemporary science, in a way that the original Robert Boyle, who founded these lectures, would have applauded. The subject of today's lecture is religion natural? That was at the heart of Robert Boyle's concerns. He considered that there were good reasons to believe in God's existence that would persuade the open-minded. But he also made a serious attempt to identify reasons why they might not persuade everyone. But rather than saying more about that, it's my great pleasure to hand over to the Boyle Lecturer for 2024, the Very Reverend Professor David Fergusson.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I've had a sound test, but since then the building has filled up. If at any point you can't hear me and you would like to, then please wave your hand or gesticulate in some way. But let me begin by thanking Fraser for his very generous introduction and say how honoured I am by the invitation to deliver the Boyle Lecture this evening. Though my mother's maiden name is Boyle, I can claim no ancestral connection, only an admiration for Robert Boyle and the illustrious thinkers who have held this lectureship dedicated to his name. They provide a testimony to the ways in which science and religion have been regarded as largely complementary and very seldom in collision, despite some popular myths. I thank the current lectureship committee for their invitation, Fraser Watts for his guidance and organisation, and in anticipation, Professor Fiona Ellis for her willingness not only to read my manuscript, but also to deliver a response this evening. Is religion natural? It's not a new subject for the Boyle Lectures. Several of the early series offered a range of confident arguments for the naturalness of religion. These had an obvious apologetic function in confirming the existence of God, presumably at a time of rising levels of skepticism and heterodoxy. In 1718, John Leng, later Bishop of Norwich, offered three complementary accounts for the rise of religion. He spoke about the force of education and tradition, the evidences for design, and the constitution of the human mind. All these, he said, confirm the inevitability of belief in God. As a cumulative case, these three considerations explain the universality of religious belief and practice. Leng then continued his argument by seeking to refute accounts of atheist societies in the travel literature of his time. By virtue of our natural condition, he argued, everybody is inclined to think and to act religiously. All the leading theologians of the church have agreed with that. Religion, they've claimed, is natural to our human condition, and its fulfillment in whatever form is our intended end. We reach our goal as human creatures only in right relation to God. You have made us for yourself, Augustine writes at the beginning of his Confessions, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. This assumption about the human condition is already evident in classical philosophy, for example, in the Stoicism of Cicero. He writes that the contemplation of the heavens gives rise to the sense of a superior power. This faith is constant across the ages and generations of humankind, and in this way the gods have declared their presence to us. Affirmations of the naturalness of religion have been viewed both positively and negatively by theologians. The Apostle Paul writes of a universal human religiosity that has become corrupt. This is his theme in Romans chapter 1. Whereas according to the book of Acts, he also suggests an initially sound if minimal knowledge of God derives from our awareness of the regularity of nature. Religion may be distorted and idolatrous, in which case it has to be corrected, or religion in its natural form may provide a bedrock of belief which can be clarified and extended by appeal to divine revelation. Either way, this is a force to be described and understood. In the 16th century, John Calvin postulated a sensus divinitatis, a sense of the divine, which he took to be an inherent feature of every human society. He doesn't rate this highly, for he claims that we need the spectacles of Scripture to clarify our natural vision. Nevertheless, there is something out there that matters. Others have offered modified proposals. Karl Rahner, Roman Catholic theologian of the 20th century, suggests that we have an awareness of the unconditioned in all our thinking and activity. Wolfhart Pannenberg, a German Lutheran theologian, claimed that the trust in what lies beyond us and on which we are dependent first begins in our relationship we have with our mothers, but quickly it leads to an acquired awareness of God as the transcendent source of our existence. More recently, the psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist has produced evidence to show that children have what he calls an intuitive theism, and this persists even without cultural or familial reinforcement. The mere fact that most or all people have believed in God or the gods does not, of course, guarantee the veracity of such belief. Considered as an argument for God's existence, this is hardly watertight. Pierre Bayle once remarked that neither general tradition nor unanimous consent can place any injunction upon truth. Moreover, beliefs about the gods vary considerably. These beliefs can't all be true, given that there are obvious inconsistencies. For example, that between polytheism and monotheism. The greater the variety uncovered, the less likely that there is any convergence upon a single core set of beliefs or practices. And as we're well aware, in the modern era, we are faced with many people, at least in some parts of the world, including this, for whom belief in God has ceased to be the default position. Yet perhaps this is too swift. The fact that most people who have ever lived have practiced some form of religious faith is not insignificant. We have, after all, no trace of a human society that lacked religious expression. And this deserves the kind of serious consideration that's often lacking in a secular culture. I'm sometimes surprised by those who express skepticism around the academic study of religion and theology. For after all, about 85% of the world's population continues to adhere in some way to a world religion. Though the consensus is not universal, it remains pretty strong. The key terms in this debate and in the way I've posed the question require some initial clarification. The concept of religion is itself too often reduced to a set of beliefs or a worldview. But we've long been aware that a simple essentialist definition will fail to capture the complexity of the phenomena. Religion is as much about what people do in terms of ritual, codes of behavior, forms of social organization, diet, clothing, and devotional practices. To reduce it to its theoretical or speculative content is to distort its wider expressions in our communities. People, I think, can practice faith even amidst some uncertainty or unclarity about what they actually believe. Indeed, congregational studies suggest that people within the same close-knit group can believe quite different things. Nevertheless, a coherent account of religion will still require to say something about its cognitive commitments and how these shape emotion and behavior. The term natural is also a slippery one. A spectrum of meaning is evident. As animals, we need to eat, walk, and sleep. These are natural activities that require little, if any, instruction. Instinctive or intuitive, we quickly acquire them even before we can speak. Other skills have to be learned, though these might also be considered natural, for example, learning one's mother tongue. Another set of activities can be quickly learned to the extent that these are performed as if we say by second nature. Riding a bicycle requires some learning, but once mastered in childhood, the skill is likely to remain ingrained until late life. I'm often surprised in Cambridge by how many people who seem in other respects quite frail can ride a bike without difficulty, and I may soon be amongst them. In addition to these senses of nature, we might also think of nature teleologically in terms of what constitutes a fulfilled human life, one that attains its end. This generates a series of capabilities or functions that some philosophers regard as natural and morally significant for the fulfillment of our nature. To function well, we need, for example, health, education, work, and friendship. Disputes arise over what to include in these capabilities that constitute a fulfilled life. Yet these accounts are generated by whatever we take to fulfill our nature as human beings. Religion can be considered natural in at least the third and the fourth of these senses. By virtue of our constitution, we are disposed to act and think religiously, though this may not be invariable. And we might hold, though more contentiously, that the fulfillment of our nature requires entering into a relationship with the divine, however understood, this imposing a meaning and an order upon our lives. The obvious objection today to any claim for religion as natural is a seeming absence of faith in the lives of many people, particularly in our own society. The position of no religion is rapidly becoming the default setting, with growing numbers of people ticking this box in surveys and censuses. This has become the assumed norm, as if it is religion that now has to be explained as unnatural, unnecessary, and implausible. This set of assumptions draws support from two related theories, I think. The first is akin to the standard version of the secularization thesis. Under conditions of economic, scientific, and cultural advancement, religion will gradually cease to be of widespread public significance, becoming instead a fringe activity, a private lifestyle choice of the few rather than the many. This in itself is a complex story about the rise of personal autonomy, scientific and technological advance, religious pluralism, and state neutrality. For many of our fellow citizens, the decline in religion in Western democracies is to be explained by reference to these and other factors. The predictive consequence is that where these conditions obtain, we should expect the public and institutional expressions of religion to diminish. A second theory that informs the aforementioned assumption might be described as an error theory about the origin of religion. If religious belief is an irrational delusion, then a natural rather than a theological account of its origin will be required. An error theory will look at non-theological options for a story of origins. Once this is in place, we might recognize that religious adherence is the result of a combination of social indoctrination and psychological compulsion. Under the conditions of modernity, however, the human subject may be able to discard or significantly to modify these childish assumptions about supernatural agency, divine commands, and post-mortem existence. Religion is here understood as natural but delusional and therefore dispensable. This alliance of sociological and psychological theory can support the default assumption that religion is outmoded and a largely irrelevant form of human activity. If it persists, it can do so harmlessly as a leisure time pursuit. This story, I suspect, is regarded as highly credible by a significant sector of our population, though there may be an internal tension between these two types of theory, the sociological and the psychological. If religion is ingrained in us by deep evolutionary forces, then its disappearance seems less likely than its refraction, a theme I'll return to briefly in my closing remarks. The most important scientific development in the field recently has, I think, been the emergence of what is called the cognitive science of religion, now a sustained research program across many universities. A new Oxford handbook has just been dedicated to the subject. This is part of a wider field described as evolutionary psychology. Rather than seeing religion as a unique subject requiring a peculiar set of explanations, evolutionary psychology situates it within its broader account of the human brain's evolved capacities and dispositions. Religion is a human activity that has a similar evolutionary set of explanations to other forms of belief and behavior. One researcher, Justin Barrett, summarizes it in the following terms. Given a certain kind of biological endowment and the ordinary sort of world we are typically born into, we will typically develop certain properties and attributes. These he describes as natural traits. The cognitive science of religion has recourse to several recurrent explanatory elements, and here you'll have to forgive me for becoming somewhat technical. Our cognitive systems come already with capacities that are not culturally acquired. I spoke earlier of activities for which we are naturally equipped, for example, riding a bicycle. Although these require some instruction, they can be quickly acquired, after which they function intuitively. Robert Macaulay, another theorist, describes this as a maturational naturalness. Unless impeded in some way, we're conditioned, for example, to acquire a language in our early years, maybe more than one. Our minds are not blank slates, but they come equipped with built-in biases. These are inherited as a result of long processes of biological adaptation. Natural in this sense does not mean innate. It refers to a set of capacities that under normal conditions will result in beliefs, skills, and practices. In the case of religion, these conditions result in beliefs in supernatural agents, in practical responses to these agents within our communities, and to a series of rituals whereby people orient themselves towards the same invisible agencies. The best known explanatory element in the cognitive psychology of religion is the hyperactive agent detection device, known by the acronym HADD. By virtue of this device, we over-attribute intentionality to our environment. This is also apparent in other animals. Your dog will bark at a sudden noise, for example, snow falling off the roof, even when this is not caused by another agent. As a survival mechanism, this is useful, particularly when detecting predators. An animal is safer in overdetermining agency in its environment than in underdetermination, which is much more dangerous. In infants, a capacity to grasp the significance of intentional agency is quickly apparent. Within several months, a baby can develop what has been called a naive physics, a sense of how objects can be moved by pushing and pulling, and how other agents have their own power of movement, unlike their stationary toys. This puts us early on the lookout for agents that are non-human and unseen. As this capacity quickly develops, it becomes easy for young children to think about gods as supernatural agencies and to believe in them. Related to this is also the early ability discerned in children to use teleological reasoning. The why question is one that children frequently raise. And research indicates that when pressed on why natural objects exist, about half the child respondents will say that something made them. But in the case of animals with intentional agency, 3/4 of children will state that someone made them. So their natural tendency is to ascribe some form of personal agency to the making of the world and its inhabitants. Related to this is a second recurrent theme in the cognitive science of religion, namely our capacity to conceive of counterintuitive agency. This involves a grasp of agents who cut across the more familiar categories of classification. And again, experiments with children show how well adapted they are for this sort of activity. They can imagine objects as animate and animals as personal, these possessing characteristics and behaving in ways that transcend their normal categories. You only need to watch a TV program with your 3-year-old grandchild to see how this is so. This capacity to absorb counterintuitive information is evident in the case of religious concepts. For example, those that invest natural objects with unusual powers or conceive of invisible agents. Pascal Boyer, an American scholar, notes that minimally counterintuitive ideas are memorable and are readily transmitted amongst people than more difficult and maximally counterintuitive ones. Those that have the most practical advantage will tend to be preserved and developed and transmitted. A minimally counterintuitive concept of a powerful supernatural agent with information and intentions will prove useful in organizing one's world. Religion, we also know, is closely connected with the expression and reinforcement of moral codes. And here the cognitive science of religion is also relevant in its theorizing. These counterintuitive agents become potentially relevant in enforcing moral codes, given their capacity to influence the world through counterintuitive properties, such as invisibility or the capacity to know our human thoughts. These allow them to witness kindness or treachery and subsequently to reward or punish human agents. Because of this connection between counterintuitive agents and morality, beliefs about these agents causing fortune and misfortune become intuitively plausible in the evolution of religion. Having an explanation of misfortunes such as catastrophic illnesses, famines, and accidents might allow us the possibility of averting such events in the future. These are amongst the standard explanatory elements of recent work in the cognitive science of religion, and I've skimmed over them very quickly. No doubt they will continue to be discussed, developed, and refined by further research programs. But what they suggest is that religion is maturationally natural in the same way that the acquisition of other skills can also be considered natural. Experiments with children provide strong evidence that our minds have evolved in ways that dispose us to think, act, and function both individually and communally as religious. This field of study is proving attractive to scholars of religion insofar as it offers an explanatory account via human evolution of the more pervasive features of religion long identified by social anthropologists and religion and historians. We cannot find a society that lacked some form of religious expression. The cognitive science of religion can explain this by its evolutionary account of its universality and recurrent features. Religion as an embedded element of human culture has been around for over 200,000 years, and it sets us apart from other animals. In relation to this evolutionary psychology of religion, the recent theological literature remains underdeveloped, as far as I can tell, with only a small number of scholars hazarding comments. Others may think it not worth the effort. So let me add my own thoughts by way of a modest contribution. I'll consider 5 questions in the remainder of this lecture. First, is cognitive science of religion reductionist? Not surprisingly, the exponents of the cognitive science of religion are divided over its theological significance. Daniel Dennett, on one side, seems confident that it provides a useful error theory to explain why our brains have tended to dupe us into believing and acting religiously. Once this is exposed, then the philosophical critique of religion that he favors is reinforced by a reductive account of religion. His use of cognitive psychology is part of a downward explanation in terms of material forces. It's a crane rather than a skyhook, he says. It represents a further extension of Darwinian commitments. Other practitioners of cognitive science of religion share this skepticism, though often it's implicit rather than declared. The subtitle of Pascal Boyer's most famous work, Religion Explained, is "The Human Instincts That Fashion Gods, Spirits, and Ancestors." This explanatory claim has some plausibility. Previous projectionist accounts of religion, for example, those offered by Feuerbach, Marx, and Freud, struggled with the empirical evidence or the lack of it. Their speculative quality has often been noted. Yet here now we have a putative theory that is rooted in robust scientific research programs and which draws strength from a wider body of work in evolutionary psychology. Here, however, I think we must distinguish causal conditions from reasons. Much of the literature seems to lean towards skepticism, as if an evolutionary account of the emergence of belief will settle the issue of validity. Explaining becomes explaining away, since the causal factors must undercut any reasons for holding that religious belief might be true. Yet this is largely a question-begging exercise. If we begin from a skeptical position, then a psychological theory might explain for us why so many people are gripped by an illusion. But the skeptical position is here presupposed rather than demonstrated by the theory. Causes and reasons belong to different frames of reference, and these are dependent upon the kind of explanation it is in view. We can tell a plausible causal story about the evolutionary factors that determine the emergence of religious belief in general. But further downstream, this doesn't answer the why questions about the specific beliefs, devotional habits, and practices that people intentionally pursue. Our brains may also be equipped by evolution to pursue science, mathematics, and technology, but the evolutionary theories that are part of that explanation have nothing to say about the veracity of scientific theories or technological progress. These demand evaluation in other terms: scientific, philosophical, theological, and ethical. It remains open to the theist in this context to claim that God might use this evolutionary outcome to dispose human beings towards belief in the supernatural. One philosopher writes, "Why shouldn't God allow those features to be the cause of the thing God wants? Rather, as the human designer of a vehicle might use the waste heat from its engine to keep its passengers warm." Much of what takes place inside a religious community is intentional. It's shaped by tradition, interpretation of texts, and development of earlier positions. Other forms of description are here required: ethnographic, historical, philosophical, and theological. Religion is a multidisciplinary field of study and should not be reduced to one totalizing theory. The temptation to assume that the evolutionary psychology of religion can do all the explanatory work should therefore be resisted. If religion is deeply implicated in making patterns of meaning and providing a lived framework for a wider set of commitments, then its eradication looks less secure. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks frequently argued for what he called the persistence of religion, through its capacity to offer meaning beyond the self, to generate trust in an order that is not of our own making, to articulate a sense of responsibility, to evoke compassion, and to sustain communities of trust and friendship. The following hypothesis is at least worthy of serious consideration. We do not begin with a clear and distinct idea of God in childhood, but our naturally evolved religious tendencies can provide the setting for deeper reflection and for an encounter with the divine. In this way, our nature can be said to find its fulfillment through divine grace. We reach our end only through encounter with God, yet the conditions of possibility are already established in our evolutionary makeup and in the ways in which we are maturationally natural. Reconfigured in this way, the earlier assumption of thinkers like Cicero and Calvin and the early Boyle lecturers, upon suitable restatement, can continue to be plausible. A second question is whether there is too narrow a focus in the cognitive psychology of religion. One worry is that these research programs concentrate only on the weird stuff, with the result that the lives of faithful people are often distorted. By focusing on fairies, ghosts, apparitions, and seemingly bizarre practices, the research ignores the more mundane activities that take place within a faith community: sharing meals, holding study groups, participating in charitable work, trying to lead a decent life by loving God and one's neighbor. Many people might adhere to a faith on account of friendship, loyalty to their family tradition, a conviction that their community is a force for good. and an overriding sense that belonging to a faith generates some meaning and structure that would otherwise be lacking in their lives. Belief commitments can actually be quite minimal here, though adherents will admittedly struggle in their complete absence or in the face of wholesale doubt. Religion is more like Wittgenstein's tools and pictures for living than a belief in Bertrand Russell's celestial teapot orbiting the earth. In this context, Fiona Ellis has defended a form of what she calls expansive naturalism, which displays an openness to embedded practices and the language of faith. A sense of the divine is given only in, with, and under the world in forms of what have been called mediated immediacy. The reductionist account will look more plausible if we misconstrue religion as only about the weird stuff. The broader scope of religion, however, should make us wary of a narrowing of perspective, with the consequence that the dismissal of faith becomes just too easy for the skeptic. A third question: should theologians declare independence from all of this? A more drastic option is simply to dismiss the whole project of the cognitive psychology of religion on theological grounds as showing the error and confusion that surround our natural religious inclinations. The cognitive science of religion would then serve the purpose only of showing how unreliable these tendencies are in relation to our knowledge of God. In this context, the program has been dubbed the cognitive psychology of idolatry, given the very different shape of classical religion. This maneuver is often an overture to a positive theology that appeals to revelation rather than nature. Genuine knowledge of God and of ourselves derives only from Christ, from Scripture, and the teachings of the Church. Nevertheless, despite the attractions of declaring independence, this disjunction of nature and revelation, of science and theology, is too forced, in my opinion. We can learn much about ourselves from the natural and social sciences, and it's incumbent upon the theologian to show how this is consistent with the core convictions of faith. Much of what we find in established religions appears to transpose earlier layers of ritual, bonding, behaviors, and experience. These are not simply discarded. The elements of our ancestral religions remain present, albeit in very different forms. A fourth question: do theology and science here share what we might call some unnatural similarities? Natural religious impulses require to be scrutinized, sifted, and at times even overcome. The religions of the world reflect not merely the unchecked impulses of nature, but are shaped by centuries of reflection upon sacred texts, devotional practices, rituals, and moral codes. Shifts in thought and action are evident across space and time, and much of what is taught today may be at odds with some of the religious dispositions that evolutionary psychology has uncovered. Examples that are offered include monotheism. This seems not at all obvious or natural from the perspective of childhood tendencies to believe in an array of invisible agencies. Yet monotheism is an axiom of the Abrahamic faiths. One might also point to other key theological themes. The unity of the Church across space and time may be an ideal that seems at odds with the tendency for religion to define an in-group that excludes outsiders. This might explain in part why factionalism and schism are so rife in Christian history. The doctrine of justification by grace also cuts across many of our instincts about getting our just deserts. A sense of unfairness is never far away when we learn that the unrighteous are to be rewarded instead of punished, though in our own case this is an injustice of which we are unlikely to complain. But Christian people have long felt some sympathy for the resentment of the elder brother upon learning from the servants that his father has thrown a party to celebrate the return of a total waster to the household. Or did Martha really get a fair deal when Jesus commended her sister, who hadn't lifted a hand to help with the dinner? These teachings can be hard and counterintuitive, and we often resist them in subtle and not so subtle ways. In this respect, theology, ironically, may be more like science in the contribution it makes to our knowledge. The scientist seeks not to manipulate the world, but to understand it through theorizing of an abstract quality. While this has often produced results of stunning practical importance, the drive to understand and explain requires thinking in counterintuitive ways. The Copernican hypothesis is not how the solar system initially appears to us. Microorganisms were discovered in the 17th century, but it was a long time before these were recognized as the causes of disease, the causes being seemingly disproportionate to their effects. And as has often been pointed out, Darwinism has proved difficult for many people to accept, owing to its complexity in the face of earlier hypotheses about divine design. How, after all, on earth could an organ like the eye evolve incrementally? How could very different species be the products of common ancestral origins? Science here becomes cognitively unnatural because it reliably traffics, usually sooner rather than later, in representations that are radically counterintuitive. May there not be something similar happening in theology, in distinguishing our religious instincts from the convictions of long-standing faith traditions, as a second-order reflection on what we do in our devotions and practices. Theology applies a critical standard that can confirm, contest, or even correct what is happening inside a community of faith. And this task is a continuous one in face of new challenges, cultural shifts, and intellectual advances. Religion needs to be saved from its own distortions and pathologies. For this purpose, secular criticism as well as internal may be valuable. Jonathan Sacks once asked the question, why did God create atheists? His answer was that the contribution of atheists was to prevent people of faith from believing too much in the wrong things. Finally, will faith persist? If the claims of evolutionary psychology have some validity, then we may need to revisit the standard model of secularization. This predicts that religious adherence will decline irreversibly as societies become better educated, wealthier, more diverse and tolerant, and less capable of enforcing a single religious identity. There is some strong evidence for this if we consider the rapid decline in church-going in Western Europe since the 1960s. But if the claims of the cognitive science of religion are broadly correct, then this thesis may need to be revised in two ways. First, religious decline will need to be more cautiously characterized as local and time-bound. A scrutiny of global patterns reveals a complex mosaic of religious affiliation, some of it increasingly strong in societies that are even undergoing rapid modernization. And if we consider the history of this country, we find earlier patterns of decline, followed by fresh expressions in the form of new movements, revivals, and institutional readjustments. A second query concerns the likely effect of the decline of institutionalized religion in our own context. Given our natural religious instincts, we might expect a manifestation of religious tendencies in different ways. The phenomenon of what is called the spiritual but not religious is receiving increasing attention. Many people, when polled, will say that they belong to no religion, but 95% of people still tell the pollsters that they believe that there is more to reality than can be expressed in forms of material description. Much of the Green movement has a spiritual dimension, with its language of the sacred, its reverence for nature, and its quest for creaturely harmony. Different forms of spiritual awakening are making the so-called new atheism of the earlier part of this century now look dated. And merely to dismiss successful adaptations of faith as ways of internalizing secular values or hollowing them out from within seem somewhat contrived. Charles Taylor wagers that faith will persist, albeit in new ways, since the secular alternatives offer no adequate substitute in the strife for meaning, order, transcendence, transformation, and wholeness. Where this will lead is hard to predict. Prognostications of irreversible decline or a return to the status quo ante seem hazardous to me. But given our natural human condition, it seems highly unlikely that religion is set to disappear irreversibly, either here or anywhere else. Even in the absence of intellectual clarity and institutional commitment, its manifestations are to be expected. So to return to my question, is religion natural? The answer is yes, and we should expect it to persist, though in what forms, it's much less easy to foretell. Thank you very much for your attention this evening.
It's my pleasure now to introduce, to respond to that lecture, Professor Fiona Ellis, a philosopher, Professor of Philosophy and Religion at the University of Roehampton, where she's director of the Centre for Inclusive Humanities, one of the major research centres there. She's also a former president of the British Society for Philosophy of Religion and one of the most respected philosophers of religion in Britain. She's directed several funded projects on religious understanding, the relationship between naturalism and supernaturalism, the philosophy of love and desire, and the meaning of life. Her books include God, Value, and Nature, and she's currently working on another, The End of Desire, Meaning, Nihilism, and God. We very much welcome her here tonight to respond to today's Boyle Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Fergusson has offered a rich and hugely interesting response to the question of whether religion is natural. He's identified some important methodological themes. What is the best way to approach this question? Is it adequately comprehended in scientific terms? He's made explicit its relevance for the atheist-theist debate, and he's made clear also that there are unclarities in the very terms of the question, unclarities which should make us hesitate before jumping too quickly to a conclusion. In what follows, I want to touch upon all of these themes, using my discussion to expand upon some of the central insights of David's magnificent paper. Let me begin by saying something about the significance of the question, is religion natural? It's of particular significance in the current intellectual climate, for the default position in much, but not all, philosophy and science is that naturalism is true and that naturalism is the only respectable position, intellectually speaking. Naturalism is defined negatively as anti-supernaturalism, where this is said to involve an opposition to things like God, gods, souls, and all the other spooky supernatural things taken seriously by the supernaturalist. And this leaves us with a suitably sanitized natural realm, which has been shorn of the offending items. Understood from this perspective, the question, is X natural, is appropriately loaded. A negative answer suggests that it's supernatural, spooky, and not to be taken seriously. A positive answer suggests that X can be taken seriously after all. The implication here is that we need to be able to say that religion's natural if we're to take it seriously. Now, things are rather more complex than this simple narrative suggests for several reasons. First, it needs to be made clear that the notions of naturalism and the natural are to be understood, how they're to be understood at a more positive level, i.e., once we've made clear what is to be avoided, the supernatural, the spooky. Second, the notion of religion is itself rather difficult to pin down. For example, it can be taken to be synonymous with the religious, as when we say that human existence involves a religious dimension, or when we talk of a religious person or religious experience. However, it can also be understood as a social phenomenon, as when we talk of organized religion, or following a particular religion, or losing one's religion. This is not to deny that the two interpretations can be, and often are, intertwined. The point is simply that they can be separated too, and, depending upon one's focus, can yield very different questions. Our religious experience is natural. Is it natural for humans to be religious? Are religions, or some religions, natural? Add to this the worry about the very meaning of natural, and a kind of vertigo begins to descend. We can begin to get a grip on this vertigo by turning, as David does, to the cognitive science of religion. This turn is significant for my purposes, because one way of addressing the question of what natural means at a more positive level is to define it in scientific terms. The natural is equivalent to the scientific, and the question of whether some X is natural, and hence respectable, becomes the question of whether it can be comprehended scientifically. There are some oversimplifications here. I'm short on time. But the claim to be explored now is that religion counts as natural only if it can be comprehended scientifically, and that one significant science in this context is cognitive science. More specifically, the idea is that religion and the religious are, in a sense to be further explained, the products of natural cognitive processes. But what does this mean? Is the idea that religion and the religious are shown to be mere constructions of human cognition? Or is it rather that the relevant cognitive processes put us in a position to discern what is really there? These metaphysical questions must surely exceed the limits of cognitive science alone, although, as David illustrates, there are attempts to vindicate a theistic approach along such lines through the idea of a hyperactive agent detection device. The human mind can discern agential characteristics in things, and this is how we're prompted to believe in God. This doesn't help at all, however, in resolving the metaphysical question of whether the activation of this natural tendency in a religious context puts us in a position to discern what's really there, or whether it's just one more example of the mind's tendency to spread itself on things, which is precisely what the atheist cognitive scientist will say. Where does this leave the question of whether religion's natural? Cognitive science can tell us an awful lot about the cognitive processes without which we should be unable to enjoy religious states of mind and engage meaningfully in religious practices. And to the extent that this approach is scientifically legitimated, we can say that religion and the religious can be naturalized to this degree at least. However, this level of explanation must remain silent on the question of the truth or falsity of religious experiences or religions, or whether we should be theists or atheists. For the resolution of these things, we need to ascend to a different, non-scientific level of explanation and be prepared to allow that, at a certain limit, explanations themselves must come to an end. We are, after all, operating at the blurry limits of our capacity to comprehend in such contexts, and reject this limitation only at the cost of lapsing into idolatry. Am I denying that religion's natural? Certainly I am, if this means no more than it cannot be comprehended without remainder in scientific terms. In MB, this is, of course, not a rejection of science, but a rejection of scientism, the assumption that science is the only respectable measure and arbiter of reality. So, I'm suggesting that there's more to religion and the religious than what can be comprehended scientifically. It goes beyond the natural in this sense. However, and bearing in mind the seal of intellectual respectability that comes with the naturalist label, I see no reason to deny that religion and the religious could be natural in a more expansive sense. What could this mean? It involves allowing that there is more to the natural than what can be measured scientifically, that this does not preclude the possibility of saying something intelligent and explanatory about the relevant phenomena. There's more to explanation than scientific explanation. And even that there will be cases where our explanations just give out. But isn't this the point where the supernatural comes into the picture? All the spooky entities that the naturalist is desperate to avoid, and which religion and the religious surely involve. My considered response to this, as an expansive naturalist, is to challenge the pejorative way of characterizing religious phenomena and to make a plea for a conception of the natural world and our natural human being, which is broad enough and open-minded enough to accommodate the possibility that, parce a certain kind of dualist, we are not, as William James put it, left outside of the deepest reality in the universe, but, quotes, substantially fused into it. That's James's radical empiricism. Now, there's a sea of philosophy and theology in this important idea, but it's an idea which suggests that religion and the religious are the most natural things of all, and that we're put in touch at these levels with the deepest realities. The atheist will naturally protest that this is too spooky to be taken seriously, but there are two responses to this. First, it certainly does sound a bit spooky if it's a matter of allowing that our hyperactive agent detection devices do, after all, put us in touch with a super weird being who exists at the deepest recesses of the universe. Nicholas Lash called this Loch Ness theology. Second, however, we must challenge the assumption that this is an appropriate model through which to comprehend what it could mean to relate to God, and consider the possibility that the supposedly more mundane activities that David details, being decent, living a decent life, loving others, are genuine parts of what it means to be truly religious, and that it is at this level of interaction that we are substantially fused into the deepest reality in the universe. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the 2024 ISSR Boyle Lecture on Science and Religion. For more information about ISSR or the Boyle Lectures, please visit our website, the link for which you can find in the description box below. If you have joined us for the YouTube premiere on 06 March 2024, then please switch now to join us for a live discussion with the lecturer, Professor David Fergusson, and respondent, Professor Fiona Ellis, who are joined by Dr. Joanna Leidenhag, Dr. Russell Ree Manning, Professor Fraser Watts, and Professor Niels Gregerson. The link for the live discussion is located in the digital Boyle Lecture invitation email that you use to access this video. However, if you are watching this anytime after that date, then you can watch the discussion right here on the ISSR YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining us, and we will look forward to seeing you again next year.